So this would be good because we'll look at it. You know, the thing of it is when we cover this parent-child archetype, it's a dual focus archetype. You look at the perspective of the parent, the perspective of the child. So we can all focus on it from our own childhood, which will really deepen your understanding about some of your environmental conditionings and your parental conditionings that you've had. All right, so what I wanted to do is just briefly go over the cycle of phases and aspects and help you understand the math of it, okay? Because when we drew the circle and, you know, the first point of Aries, when we make the 0 out of the 360, sometimes people can think if they got a planet here, then that's where you start. And this circle moves because you always want to make the slower moving planet the stationary or starting point, and you want to go in a counterclockwise fashion to the faster moving planet, okay? So we're going to go back to this circle of 12, okay? And bear with my circles. Whoops. Yeah. That's not white. That's okay, yeah. I want to use actual chart to show them. Okay, so we do want to go back to 12, even though this isn't just exactly right. So let's use an example here, and let's go Mars, and let's go Venus, all right? So if we look at this example with Mars and Venus, is Venus the faster moving planet and Mars the slower moving planet? All right. Venus goes around the chart about once a year. Mars goes through the zodiac once every 2 years or 26 months. So this is the slower moving planet. All right. And let's do this for simplicity's sake. We're going to put Mars at 0 degrees Taurus. We're going to put Venus at 0 degrees Aquarius, and it just so happens this is the Taurus house, this is the Aquarius house, but it makes a simple example. So if you started with Mars and Mars became the 0 point, in a nutshell, this is a 270-degree aspect, a last quarter square. That's exact, all right? And again, one of the ways in which you can do this, okay, is that you have to learn how to just run the numbers in 30-degree increments. 30, 60, 90, 120, 150, 180, and you learn to do that as an astrologer, and that's how you can add that up. And you get to the point where you can actually just visually look and start to guess where it's at. And of course now you've got all your little grids that come with circle charts to help you out with everything, okay? But for instance, if this Venus here was at, let's say Venus was here at 25 degrees Capricorn, and we've got 0 degrees Taurus, okay? So you could go like this. This is also a way you can do it. You can run Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sag, Capricorn. So if you were at 0, if Mars is right here at 0 degrees Capricorn, what would you have? You've had 30, 60, 90, 120, 150, 180, 210. Am I missing a sign? I'm not missing anything, am I? To go through this, and 210, and then this would be 240, and then it's 25 degrees Capricorn, so that would be 265. See how I did that? I'll repeat it for you. We have Mars at 0 degrees Taurus, just for simplicity's sake. You can come up here and you can go Mars at 0 degrees Taurus. 0 Taurus to 0 Gemini, 30 degrees. You add on to 0 Cancer, 60 degrees. So you learn how to just do the signs, and you're counting in 30 degrees. You get to Capricorn, you're 240, but Venus is at 25 Capricorn, so you got to add on another 25 to get 265. That is 5 degrees less than the 270 degree mark. So this is a disseminating square when Venus is at 25 Capricorn. If Venus is at 0 degrees Aquarius, then you add on another 5, and you're 270 degrees. You're an exact last quarter square. If Venus is at 5 degrees Aquarius, you'd add on another 5 degrees, and you're at 275. Then you're 5 degrees past that last quarter square. All right? And I know your head's like going, this is nuts, but you're taking it in on some level. Okay? But that's how you do it. And the thing of it is this stationary planet, the slower planet, the starting point, can be anywhere in this zodiac. But that becomes the 0 point in this example, and then you just go all the way around to whatever planet you're going to go to. Now, the other thing that I did is when you look at your handouts, you'll see that I gave you some multiple examples to try and help you, so that you can then be able to see where I've drawn the lines around to try and guess that. But anytime you're looking at any two planets, because here's what's happening. Here's what traditional astrology will do. They'll look at these two planets and they'll only see this energy. Whereas if this is the slower planet, all of this energy is what came before in the relationship of Venus to Mars. Okay? Does that make sense? I'm just trying to explain the math and just trying to get you to conceptually see that Venus is 3/4 of the way around the chart from Mars, so there's a lot of history between these two planets. Now, whenever you're looking at another one, this is still the same concept that we're working with, and that is when we're working with conjunctions. So let's go over here in the 8th house, all right? And we're going to put Saturn in here, all right? And we're going to put Mercury right here, all right? And so let's just make this Saturn here at 15 degrees Sagittarius, and this Mercury is going to be over here at 0 degrees Sagittarius. Well, I better make it 5 to make it a conjunction. I'll make it 5 degrees Sag. Okay, so we're looking at two different houses, but Mercury's 5 Sag, Saturn's 15 Sag, 10 degrees apart, okay? People will just start to read that as a conjunction. Is this a balsamic conjunction or a new phase conjunction? Balsamic. Gemini soul. I'm going to speak. Here's what you would do. Is Saturn the slower moving planet? Mercury the faster moving planet? You would start with Saturn at 15 Sag, and you would go all the way around the chart to get to Mercury. And this is 350 degrees. You have to go 350 degrees around a circle from Saturn to get to Mercury. That is a balsamic conjunction. That tells you this entire circle has come between Venus relating to Saturn. So a balsamic conjunction is a finishing up of a cycle. Whereas if this Mercury was over here at 25 degrees Sag, and I'm not using the houses right, okay? I'm just trying to show you between the planets. If the Mercury was over here at 25 degrees Sag, this is new phase. This is an entire new cycle that's starting between these two planets. So a conjunction's not a conjunction. Is it a balsamic conjunction finishing up, or is it a new phase conjunction starting something new between any two planets? Ben?
I have a question about using this in readings. We were talking earlier about the trinities, the two trinities, and starting out there. At what point do you, do you look at the individual houses and signs and their relationship just within those archetypes on their own, and then do you start to look at the aspects, or do you just go from the...
In the planetary method of chart interpretation, we went through the Pluto and Moon's nodes formula to get the soul and its ego. All right? Then typically what you can do after that is add in the sun, which is the personality or the self-actualization. Then you add in the moon, which is that emotional self-image as it's currently existing in relation beyond its past and future. Then you add in Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune.
And after you do the individual house sign, planet relationship and what that says, then you look at aspects? Or?
How it ends up working with most astrologers is holistically. Whatever jumps out at you. I have a tendency to work with Pluto and the nodes. Then I look for any planet square the nodes and move into there. And then I start filling everything else in. And it doesn't always follow a specific order. Many times it's where's repeating themes, what's jumping out at me, what attracts me as an astrologer, what's the client asking me about. So if you have a client coming and saying, when am I going to marry? You're going to go focus in on what would be the archetypes of relationships and help them understand that. When am I going to find a job? Then you go focus in on whatever archetypes help them understand that. So it varies as to what you use. Okay? And it's a lot of it is personal preference. Once you get past the soul and its ego, and are there any skip steps, then you can just start adding everything else on. And it may be you got a client coming in and they have a whole bunch of transits going on that are really activating their Mars. And so you can't ignore it because that's really going to be affecting on how they're going to go after what they want in the world. Mars, conscious actions, and desires. Okay? So there gets to be variations of it with that. But in a lot of your typical astrology, it can get very confusing with all the planetary archetypes and all their signs, houses, and aspects. Where do I start? This is the beauty of evolutionary astrology. It gives you the foundation of the soul and its ego, and from there you can go in any direction. You can look at whatever the client wants to know. Does that help? Okay. Anybody else with questions? You're getting this. And if you don't, go look at those sheets that I gave you as example. And then practice with your own charts. And ground yourself in the cycle of phases and aspects. I've taught myself to say phase first, aspect second. Because there may or may not be an aspect, but every two planets have a phasal relationship to each other. But to help you understand, for instance, Saturn is the structure of consciousness. It's the individuated consciousness. Well, how does Saturn and Mercury relate? Which is how do we process through what we're conscious of, and how do we communicate what we're conscious of? Venus and Saturn. How do our values and needs relate to our structure of consciousness? Mars and Saturn. How do we go out after getting what our consciousness is figuring out we want? Mars, Saturn. Okay, so you could start to bring any two planets together, but if you can get Pluto and the nodes of the moon, the soul and its ego, if you can get skip steps, planets square the nodes, and where's the resolution node? And then if you can bring in cycle of phases and aspects as you start to bring it all together, you've got some core concepts that will really allow you to develop your astrological studies. that will then allow you to address whatever it is that your clients want when they come into you. And almost all of us as astrologers end up having areas where we like to focus. I love Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the 3 planets of the unconsciousness. I gravitated to them in astrology, and your traditional astrology kind of bangles it up a lot with those 3 planets. And I found them fascinating. So when anybody comes in, I always want to know what their Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus are doing. And so you'll all have your own areas, but those are just really nice, succinct things to really ground in with evolutionary astrology. Because, we've all been in those situations where we run into the astrologer who starts rolling, well, this is this, and this is this, and this is this, and this is this, and, square that, trine that, inconjunct that, and, And again, in astrology, because it's the language of the soul, and souls are complicated, we can project that complication onto the client, and they can be more confused. So less is more. Simplify those archetypes, and then you can really help that client ground. The day before we left, Leroy's niece came in for a counseling with me, and of course I'm Aunt Kimmy, and she has never looked at astrology. It was her second time. She came in once with her ex, and it didn't quite work out, and so now she's come in as a single person, and she says, I'm fascinated with this stuff. And I said, okay, so let me help you. And we only went over Pluto and Neptune. And that's all I focused on. I said, here's your soul. And you've got some, she has Neptune conjunct the sun. And they're in Sag. And she says, I read these sun sign books about Sag. And she says, I don't feel like a Sag. I said, well, that's because Neptune's conjunct the sun in Sag in the 8th house. I said, you got all this water. 8th house, Scorpio house, Neptune rules Pisces, conjunct the sun. I said, you got all this water, but I said, guess what? You got a lot of steam. And she just, oh, that's it. That's how I feel. I feel like I'm a bunch of steam. And it was Sag and that Scorpio Neptune. So don't overwhelm them. Break it down and then simplify that. And you take them a little nugget. And so she's our cat sitter. She's staying at the house while we're gone and taking care of the 3 cats and the house and all that kind of stuff. So, and of course, what do I have in my room? All the cookbook astrology books. And so I left her chart. I left her a sheet of all the glyphs, and all the books. And I said, there you go. See what you can do over the next 10 days. And so she'll explore in whatever areas help her. So you get grounded in this, I have a tendency to call it the Pluto formula. It's the planetary method of chart interpretation, okay? You get grounded in that. You get grounded in any planet square the nodes and where the soul is stuck. And then you get these cycle of phases and aspects, and you've got some meat to work with for your own chart and to help anybody else that you want to draw to you as a client. And ground yourself in that stuff, and then after that, you can decide where you want to go in and focus, where your specialties are. Some evolutionary astrologers then want to go on to the asteroids. Okay? What we're going to work with today, what really was, our meat to get into, is what we call parent-child dynamics. And so I'm going to phase into that unless I have questions. This was brief. And you've got your sheets to work with. Questions before I move on?
I guess my only question would be, do you particularly look at the phasal aspect of the rulers of the nodes in relation to, say, Pluto or the nodes? Is that like a
Oh, yes.
place you would go in the beginning?
Yes, you can look at Pluto and the phasal relationship of the south node to Pluto. Because the south node is in a phasal relationship to Pluto, regardless of whether or not there's an aspect. And the north node's in a phasal relationship to Pluto. And when you work with the trinity of the past, you can work with that south node and Pluto together. When you work with the trinity of the future, you can work with the Pluto polarity point and the north node together. You can work with that. The nodes are compared to all the planets. So whether you're working with Pluto, or whether you're working with Venus or Mars, the nodes of the moon are compared to the planets. So you would start with the planet, go clockwise to the node.
When you're considering the slow versus the fast, the south node is faster compared to all the planets except the outer ones, which when it changes,
No, that's where some astrologers, when I ran Jeffrey's school for 6 years, there was another astrologer and she went in for us because we were confused. There were several of that second generation after Jeffrey that were kind of confused. How do you work with aspects to the nodes, planets aspecting the nodes? And we went through years of Jeffrey's writings. And 70% of the time, what he wrote, what he would say was, when it's the moon's nodes in any planet, you start with the planet and you go clockwise to the node. And you go clockwise, you go clockwise to the first node, whatever it is, and then you kept going and going and going, and you go clockwise to the second node, which would be, halfway or half a circle around from that first node you ran into. No matter which planet. Yeah. And that's what out of those 3 handouts I gave you, that's what that says. Yeah. That was kind of like one of my biggest questions when I took over.
You're saying that Pluto is slower than the nodes in that relationship. You treat it as
When we're looking at the moon's node to any of the natal planets, any of the natal planets, we always make the natal planet the stationary point or the 0 point, and we go clockwise to the nodes of the moon. And you'll notice one of those pages is an example of only planets, only the moon's nodes to the planets. And there's some multiple examples in there. Yep. You bet. Any other questions with that? Okay. All right, so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to shift into parent-child dynamics. And so what we're going to work with is a series of planetary archetypes, all right, or astrological, not planetary, a series of astrological archetypes. And there really isn't any order to these archetypes. So we're going to take them step by step because it's the only way we can do it, is we've got to deal with Mercury in the left brain. But before that, let's look at a couple of things philosophically. As we look at these astrological archetypes, there is a dual focus. You can look at any astrological chart, and it will give you clues as to how that soul perceived their parenting. And it will show you how that soul will evolve into being a parent themselves. If we look at these perspectives through the chart, and we look at the perspective of the soul and how it perceived its own parenting, that can be different than how that child's parents perceived their own parenting. Let's be concrete. Here's our circle again. All right. I'll say it generally. Children and parents can have different perspectives of how the child is raised. Okay? The child will have its perspective of how it was parented. The parents will have their perspective of how they raised the child. And those can be two different perspectives.
Aren't they always?
Yes. I mean, just think about it. Just think of your own parenting, how your parents raised you, and things that you perceived of what the parents did. And all of us are old enough now where we've had those conversations with our parents, and, well, that wasn't my perspective of it. That wasn't how I raised you. Okay? So, if you will, please, I'm going to give you a very personal example. But we'll break it down through this personal example, okay? All right. Oops, wrong planetary symbol. Well, I'll start out right here. For us as well. Well, no, I better put these two in. I better get these in. So first of all, I'm just going to list the different archetypes that we will work with when we want to work with parent-child dynamics, all right? First of all, you're going to work with what is the sign on the 4th house cusp. And if you want to, you can just make a list, leave a little bit of room to come back to that list, or you can repeat the list. Sign on the 4th house cusp. Sign on the 10th house cusp. Where is the sign Cancer? Where is the sign Capricorn? Planets in the 4th house, planets in the 10th house. Planets in Cancer, planets in Capricorn. The Moon in Saturn. Planetary ruler of the sign on the 4th house. Planetary ruler of the sign on the 10th house. Those are all of the various archetypes for parent-child dynamics. All right? There's no specific order in how you want to go through those. Those dynamics, as you move through them and add them all up, will describe the parent-child dynamics in any specific chart. So let's go back over that list. All of us have a zodiacal sign on our 4th house cusp. We have a sign on our 10th. That sign on the 4th house cusp will show you how the child perceives their early environment, how they perceive their familial nurturing in their early childhood development. The sign on the 10th house cusp will show you how the child perceived their parents and all of the consensus reality of their parents. How they perceived their parents as authorities in their life. With our example, and I noticed, some of you have already shared birth data and have been interested in readings, and so I drew up charts before I left and kind of went through them on the airplane. I was fascinated by the room and the charts that I had seen because we had a predominance of either Pisces, Virgo 4th, 10th, or Virgo, Pisces 4th, 10th. And then there were, I think, one or two Cancer on the 4th, Capricorn on the 10th thrown in. But I was amazed at that, so I'm going to use some of this as example. So let's just look at that. There's a sign on the 4th house cusp, and that will describe the early nurturing environment of any soul. And here's another thing that I will show you when we're working with evolutionary astrology. In traditional astrology, the moon represents mother and Saturn represents father. Really, in most astrology, but evolutionary astrology will really counsel this. The moon will represent the most nurturing parent, who may or may not be the mother today. Saturn will represent the more authoritarian parent, that may or may not be the father today. All right? So this 4th house cusp is going to represent the early nurturing environment that any soul receives that has a direct effect on the self-image that they create. That self-image being so emotionally based and being so tied into the ego. Because this is naturally the Cancer house. This is naturally where Cancer resides. This is the 4th house. This is the house that the moon naturally rules. Cancer is the sign that the moon naturally rules. So what we're dealing with here with this sign on the 4th house cusp is, again, that early emotional nurturing. All right? So if we have an example and we put Pisces on the 4th house cusp, this is the Neptune house, or Neptune sign. If we have Pisces on the 4th house cusp, there could be a variety of context or a variety of reality examples from the archetype of Pisces on the 4th. Could one of the Piscean examples be somebody whose early nurturing environment was like all-consuming and just feeling like going back into the womb? Pisces, Neptune. A little soul here who could feel that it was just, totally nurtured. Anything it needed, its parents, Pisces, Neptune, osmosisly interpreted and fed to the child, and the child didn't have to do anything, and it had these intuitive parents that just kind of anticipated every need and met them. Another example, child who has Pisces on the 4th house cusp was born into alcoholic parents. Total abandonment of the child. See how we need the environmental context to the archetype? But we're talking about the Pisces archetype. either back in the womb and just totally all consuming and there and nurturing the child, or complete abandonment of the child. Pisces could represent both. Yes, it could be. Could be the abandonment. You know, could be parents that weren't there. We've got Virgo up here on the 10th house cusp, which is going to describe any soul's perception of how they were parented. This little soul, let's use these two examples, okay? We're not even into Saturn and the moon yet, okay? Let's take them, I'll take them back out of the equation so that's not coloring what you're hearing so far. But we've got the ruler Neptune in Capricorn, the ruler Virgo is Mercury in Libra in the 12th, all right? But we haven't got there yet. We're just working with this archetype on the 4th and the 10th, all right? Let's take a little soul who's born into a Pisces 4th house environment, and these are the parents who were just totally nurturing to this child, intuited all its needs. The child felt like it was in the womb all the time. Could we perhaps have a child that doesn't grow up? It just wants to remain the infant. And we come over here and it has the perception of someday waking up to the fact that their parents are saying, listen, you got to grow up, you got to handle life, you got to take care of your chores, you got to do your details. But this child who had all its needs met is going, well, wait a minute, aren't you going to meet those needs? And it's a shock to this child when it comes up against this Virgo on the 10th house cusp, and the parents go from all nurturing to grow up. And it's coming from this early environment here where now it perceives the parents turning on it and becoming critical. Okay? Go back to the example where we had the child who had Pisces on the 4th house cusp and it was born into an alcoholic family and it had no early nurturing. And so it had no feeling abandoned by the parents. So feeling abandoned by society, feeling abandoned by in that early nurturing environment. And it comes up here and has a perception of the parents, and the parents were mean and cruel. But let's just say the parents they drank, but they still loved their kid. And they came home and had alcohol once in a while, or whatever it was, because they worked 3 jobs. So up here, a 10th house cusp is going to be the child's perception of the parents in their environment of the world, in their consensus reality. But this 10th house cusp is also going to describe how the parents thought they parented. And in this case right here, the parents who had some addiction issues were going, wait a minute, we worked our butts off for you. We were always trying to work to provide you enough clothes and enough shoes. And not only that, we worked to come up with the money to send you to college. How can you, be so ungrateful? You can start to see how there's many realities or contexts that can start to come from this environment. But when we've got Pisces on that 4th house, we've got idealistic projections. We have got all of the Piscean confusion that may not notice the reality of the parental environment. We can go back to this child who was just totally nurtured by the parents, feeling very safe in their cocoon. And at some point, the parents start saying, we want you to be responsible. And the child's perception of those parents is that, well, you were always here for me, and now you're not. Why won't you do it for me? The parent's perception could be, wait a minute, we did so well meeting all these needs for this child that it never had to be in the real world, and now the parents are going, whoa, wait a minute, did we over nurture? What do they call them today? Helicopter parents? You know, they're hovering around and anything that the child needs. So the kid never falls down and scrapes his knee. So the kid never knows that, you know, I got to get back up on the bicycle and ride again. That, you know, there's little scrapes along in life. Does this make sense? And how? Go ahead, Ben. I think it's...
Is that the predominant meaning of the fourth house cusp?
I used two extreme examples to just show you. We could have Pisces on the fourth house cusp, and we could have the extreme of helicopter parents who hover around and meet every need.
I guess I'm asking more about the cusp itself. That cusp, is that your perceptions of your parents?
Yes, this is the child's perception of its early nurturing environment that has a lot to do with how the child develops its self-image from that early environment.
Okay, I was just curious if there was anything else that those, you know, being the top and bottom of the chart, if it represented anything else as well? Or
In regards to parenting and child?
Maybe this is too broad a question just for...
It might be too broad of a question. I mean, when we look at the 12 houses, the fourth house is always the emotional self-image. Okay? It's the emotional self-reliance lessons. The 10th house is always self-determination and self-responsibility. Inner security, outer security. Those are the broad archetypes of the 4th and the 10th. We're going to go in and focus then, because this is the Cancer moon-ruled house. This is the Saturn Capricorn-ruled house, okay? We're going to go in and focus this on, this is the early nurturing environment that the child had and developed, that played the major role in developing its self-image, okay? And then this is how it perceived its parents doing their job and parenting them out in the world. So this has a huge effect then on how this soul grows up and has an inner security, outer security.
So it's kind of what we're covering is almost the basis for other uses of the interpretation of inner security and outer security.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. But again, this is the child's perception of its early environment developing self-image. But this also will show the parent's perception of how they nurtured the child. The parents who met all the child's needs without any effort of the child having to do anything could then also have their own perception of their parenting as sacrificing themselves and having to recognize that this child grew up thinking it needed to have everything given to it without any effort on its part. So the 4th house cusp will describe the early nurturing environment from the child's perspective and the parent's perspective. The 10th house cusp will describe how the parents operated in the world and their consensus values and authority, both the child's perception of it and how the parents of that child themselves perceived it. So the same archetype, child's perspective, parent's perspective, self-image, early nurturing. Same archetype, child's perspective, parent's perspective, how they needed to grow up and function in the world. Does this make sense with that? For example, let's do it this way. And again, we can draw these back in. But let's just go like this. Got these charts in the room too. Let's flip it around. We're still dealing with that same thing, the early nurturing environment that affects the development of the self-image. And then all of the consensus and parental environments out there in the world and how we go out into the world. If we flip this around and we have Virgo on the 4th house cusp, what could be some of the examples of the type of early conditioning that a child receives? Controlling, critical. Pardon? Religious? Religious would be probably more with the Pisces, although with the Virgo polarity, you could get religious out of there. But I guess I'm asking more psychological dynamics from Virgo, which is the 6th house in Mercury. Judgments. So that would be the deeper archetype under the religions. Okay? Judgmental. Yes, yes. Could we have, with Virgo on that 4th house cusp, could we have an early environment where perhaps one parent was highly critical, very critical, and the child could be led to feel guilty no matter what they did. They could never do anything right. Imagine what that does in your early environment and how that affects your self-image. This could be a child who could then just withdraw into a shell. Or, in another example, a child who could come out, the sadistic side of Virgo and come out and fight back, criticize back. We could get into instead of nurturing, we could just get into yelling matches. The parents go, no, 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 and the child goes, yes, 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 no. The child just starts talking back and learning that type of an environment.
So
Argumentative. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what if we have Pisces up here on the 10th house cusp? How would this child perceive their parents and their role in parenting them and growing up out there in the world? Yep. Could easily perceive that abandonment out there. Yeah. Break it down. Let's just say this is the nurturing parent, all right? And let's say that this is the mother, but we got Virgo on the fourth house cusp. Could we find a mother that was critical? And if we've got the mother down here and we've got the father up there, father wasn't around. Drinking. Let's take this further and let's just go, let's say this example with just these two archetypes is a boy. A little boy who's being raised with a critical mother and a father who's off drinking. Then can you start extrapolating this further? A little boy grows up to think that all women bitch. Feels very sensitive whenever there's any females around that just, start biting. It's mom all over again. Sorry, honey. Guess who has Virgo on the fourth house cusp? But then if this is a little boy and this is the authoritative parent up here, how we learn to operate in the world, and this is father and he's Pisces and he's off drinking, the little boy has no role models. What if it's a little girl and this is still mom? Okay? But mom is critical. The little girl can never manage to live up to mom. So then she has all the complexes that arise around, she can never please mom. And if this is a little girl, dad may be off drinking, but whenever dad shows up, what does he do? Projects all daddy's little darling on her. So she grows up to have unhealthy relationships with women and unhealthy relationships with men, and she's looking for, that ideal who's just going to do what dad does and just tell her she's perfect, no matter what she does. And then issues with women growing up where, she's always finding that they're criticizing her and she's criticizing them. So then you can bring the gender of the child into it as my example. And you can start to see how, whether it's a female or a male as the child. And if you've got Pisces up here on the 10th house cusp, you could have a father who's off drinking, but he doesn't feel he abandoned the child. He put bread on the table. He managed to keep the job even when he wasn't around. He did everything perfect. Start to see how this works? So let's do some others. Just with the 4th and 10th house cusps, we start to bring in some real good examples. So let's do this. Taurus, Scorpio. What if we have Taurus on the 4th house cusp? What would be the early environment of a child? What would be the early nurturing environment of the child with Taurus? Materialistic. Controlling. Survival issues. Scorpio, Taurus archetype will deal with abandonment issues. You know, this could range from a child who perhaps had mother die in childbirth. Survival issues. Okay? It could be an example in a positive way of a child who felt that the early nurturing environment was very stable and secure. You know? Or it could be a child whose early nurturing environment was full of stuff, clothes and shoes and toys, you know, but the parents weren't there. You know, again, you can start to get many different types of potential things out of it in regards to the archetype. Yes?
So is it always one parent on top and one parent on bottom, or can it be both parents on the bottom?
The early nurturing environment can be both parents,
Okay.
but this will describe the more nurturing parent,
Okay.
be it the father or mother. Same thing up here. The 10th house is going to describe the parents as a whole and how the child perceived them to parent and to structure their consensus reality. Consensus, not consensus state, how they operated in the world. Okay? It will also describe the more authoritarian parent. Okay? This example could be described, let's use the traditional example and say that this described the more nurturing parent as mother. This described the more authoritarian parent as father. The example could be a mother who had to go out and work in order to put food on the table. And this could describe a father, Scorpio, a rageaholic. This was my environment. I'm very close to my mother, and my mother worked. And she worked in a day and age when most other mothers stayed home. But my mother went off and worked, so she literally could put food on the table. And my early nurturing was that, where's my mom? Where's my mom? I hated my mother working. And I lived with a rageaholic father. And so my mother would go off to work, and as soon as my sister and I were old enough to stay home by ourselves, raised on a farm, I was driving vehicles by the time I was 12 years old. I was cooking and cleaning by the time I was 8 or 9. You live on a farm, you learn how to survive. It was about survival, nothing else, Taurus. And I had a father who had some really harsh emotional environments of his own. And so it was never safe in the world. It was always, when is the next shoe going to drop? When is my father going to, at the spur of the moment, explode into one of those scorpionic rages? So this was I have Taurus on the 4th, I have Scorpio on the 10th. That was my early childhood conditionings.
It could be creative, and it's Scorpio.
Yes. Positive environment could be a parent who was just very nurturing and stable and secure, whether it was the father or the mother. And positive of the Scorpio out there could be parents who taught the child all of the wise Scorpio of the worlds. Taught them how the world operated from a psychological level so the child could go out there and figure things out. Taught the child to trust its own intuition, Scorpio, out there in the world. Trust your gut out there. Be the more positive examples of it. Okay? Does this make sense?
And for like the Virgo Pisces one, what would be the positive example of that?
Oh, the Virgo down here, you put Virgo on the 4th house cusp, and you get into that part of Virgo that is very nurturing and loving, in its natural state of learning self-love. Virgo can be very nurturing and loving. And with Virgo, the opposite of Pisces, it can really get into what we would know as devotional support. So you put Virgo down here in the 4th house cusp, you could have a mother that was totally devoted to the child and met her every need, Virgo, every detail, and the child didn't have to do anything for itself. And Pisces up here on the 10th house cusp, you know, that's Neptune. You can have, you know, parents that were wise and taught the child spiritual values that were real metaphysical from an early age, you know, and then taught them how to work with those values out there in the world to create what they wanted in the world. Yeah. So again, any one of these signs on that 4th and 10th house cusp can just be a wealth of information in what we're dealing with. In this room here, do I have somebody who does not have Virgo or Pisces on the 4th?
I have Aries and Libra.
You have Aries on the 4th house cusp, and you have Libra on the 10th. Okay, where is your Mars?
I gotta use my notes, I don't remember what mine looks like.
Yeah,
In
8th
Leo?
house.
Oh, 8th house.
8th house in Leo.
Mars is in Leo in the 8th house. Where's Venus?
11th house, or 10th house, sorry.
In? Is Venus in?
Leo, yeah.
Okay. So then the next thing that you do when you're looking at the signs on the 4th and the 10th is when you want to fill in some more details with that, you look to the planetary rulers of those signs. Okay, so let's start with what we were working with here. What could be some possibilities with Aries on the 4th house cusp? What could this child perceive as its early nurturing environment?
It's giving total freedom.
Could be total freedom. How about chaotic? Is Aries just all over the place? How is your early nurturing environment? McCall?
My early. How early are we talking? Like,
Whatever comes. From birth to, you know, I don't know, birth to 10.
birth to 10?
But, you know, the most, you know, again, the early nurturing environment will come birth to 2, then there's birth to 7. Birth to 2 is Mars, birth to 7 is Saturn. You know, there's all kinds of variables. But what are your memories of your early nurturing, your early environment?
I guess you could say chaotic. My parents divorced when I was pretty little, and Dad wasn't always consistent with seeing us or picking us up. Mom and Dad fought a lot, those types of things.
Do you feel that your early environment had a lot of anger in it?
I worked through a lot of